Is the U.S. losing the war against cyber attacks? American-trained agents reveal that other countries hired them to spy on Washington and its allies. President Joe Biden is promising to make cybersecurity a priority. So can he deliver? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The United States has one of the world's most extensive intelligence operations. The government is projected to spend just under $19 billion on cybersecurity this year. Despite this, security experts say the U.S. is losing ground to other nations who are hiring American-trained agents to spy on enemies and other Americans. The New York Times says the United Arab Emirates hired former National Security Agency operatives to target Qatar. They hacked emails between Qatar Sheikh Moza bin Nasser and Michelle Obama during the former First Lady's visit to Doha in 2015. It's the latest allegation of the UAE hiring U.S. expertise to spy on adversaries. The revelations come as America is still reeling from one of its worst ever cyber attacks. In December, hackers compromised an information technology firm called SolarWinds. They used that access to spy on the government. U.S. cybersecurity agencies blame Russia, but Moscow denies involvement. In 2015, a security breach was discovered at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. Hackers stole the personal data of more than 22 million people, many of them government employees. In 2016, both the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign were targeted. More than 40,000 emails were leaked, many containing confidential information. And over the past decades, many private companies have been hacked, including Yahoo, Sony, Adobe, and LinkedIn. Some breaches led to millions of people having their personal data compromised. That includes passwords, phone numbers, and credit card information. U.S. President Joe Biden is making cybersecurity a priority. He's hiring more experts and plans to boost funding.
We've elevated the status of cyber issues within our government, including appointing the first Deputy National Security Advisor for cyber and emerging technology. We're launching an urgent initiative to improve our capability, readiness, and resilience in cyberspace.
All right, let's bring in our guests. In Augusta, Georgia, Jake Williams, president and founder of Rendition Infosec and a U.S. Army veteran. In Geneva, Switzerland, Stéphane Duguin, CEO of the CyberPeace Institute and a former Europol official. And in Arlington, Virginia, Bryson Bort, CEO of Scythe and co-founder of ICS Village, a nonprofit organization advancing education and awareness of security for critical infrastructure. Welcome to the program. Bryson, let me start with you today. On the one hand, America is the world's most advanced cyber superpower, but it's also the most targeted. How did the U.S. become as vulnerable as it has become?
Yeah, so the expression that we have there is the reference to the glass house. And certainly as we've moved into the information age, it's no surprise that the #1 economy in the world, with modern business predicated on computers all the way into our critical infrastructure, that with how active we are in foreign policy, that conversely on the private side, that would make us vulnerable and open to those kinds of things.
Stéphane, let me ask you, from your vantage point, is the U.S. one of the countries that is most vulnerable to cyber attacks? And what's the impact of that?
Yeah, thank you for having us. The most vulnerable is kind of a complex notion. It's as long as everyone agrees that there's a business model out there where private companies can be the one deciding the kind of intrusion tools, the kind of attack tools that feed on the vulnerabilities of everyone, then at the end of the day, everyone is vulnerable because there's absolutely no oversight and no control on this kind of business model. So states are suffering from it.
Jake, in December, it was revealed that the U.S. was hit by a hacking operation that was blamed on Russia and described as the worst in American history. What is President Biden currently doing to strengthen cybersecurity?
Well, certainly there have been a number of initiatives, but I think one of the most important pieces is strengthening that public-private partnership. The reality is that today a lot of private businesses in the United States have cybersecurity regimes and cybersecurity tools and staff that are on par with or exceed what often we find in the U.S. government. regardless of whether you put the U.S. government above or below commercial space. Getting that trust back into government cybersecurity is huge, and Biden's done a lot to staff that with folks that are trusted throughout the industry to rebuild that public-private partnership.
Bryson, the New York Times article that we were citing earlier by Nicole Perlroth says that the NSA knew that the vulnerabilities it was finding and exploiting would one day blow back on Americans, that they had developed a strategy called active defense, but that strategy ultimately didn't work that well. What's your take on that? And do you think that the NSA has focused more on offense than it has on defense?
Yeah, I think the question isn't quite framed correctly, and this is where it goes sideways with the NSA, is that the National Security Agency is not solely responsible for the defense of all computers in the United States. Their mission is much more outside of the country and focused on signals intelligence to understand the intent of adversaries, or in the case of cyber attacks, some level of seeing those and attempting to disrupt them. I think we have seen plenty of precedent where the private industry has done a lot with botnet takedowns, including recently. And certainly, as Jake noted, I mean, part of what we're going to see under the Biden administration is going to be continued funding for domestic agencies like CISA, that's going to take the lead on even more of a domestic focus and a lot more public-private partnership, because it's all one connected ecosystem that has to work together to respond to these things.
Jake, I saw you nodding along to some of what Bryson was saying. Did you want to jump in?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Look, I 100% agree with what Bryson's saying here. The NSA definitely does have a much more limited mandate. They are not in charge of protecting all computers in the United States, in particular on the domestic side. And we do need more investment in that defense, defensive posture. And then reality-wise, we need timely dissemination of information from the government down to private entities. And that's what Chris Krebs and others over at CISA were working on in the last administration. I only expect to see more of that in the current administration.
Stéphane, do you believe that the average person around the world really has a good idea, a good grasp of just how vulnerable their security and the security of their respective governments are to the threat from cyber attacks and hacking and cyber warfare?
It's very difficult to grasp, first, because most of the attacks, when they are described, analyzed, I look from the point of view of financial costs, or I describe in words that are very difficult to grasp by an average citizen. And we too often forgot that the focus should be the human cost, the societal impact to the attack. You mentioning before what can we look into in terms of strategy, active defense of others. States have capacity to act way beyond just the technical offense or defense. I mean, there's international law, there's norms, there's the rules of the roads, and states and United States, for example, could already recommit to what is already existing, and making sure that this law makes sense for you and I, the one that are using the internet, and not today you have WhatsApp and NSO group which are battling in courts. Why? Because there was no international agreement whether or not intrusion tools are lawful or not. Can we buy it? Can we export them? And because of that, suddenly it's private companies battling in court that would decide the fates of vulnerabilities of millions.
Bryson, what's the level of concern in the U.S. government and in the U.S. about former members of the NSA being recruited by foreign governments or by foreign companies that have ties to foreign governments who would then use their expertise to target America and Americans?
I mean, I don't think that's an old concept. We've seen that throughout the history of humankind, where specialists in military or intelligence find their way in various private forms to other places. I think it is a bit disconcerting in this regard, where those specialists that were co-opted or willingly or unwillingly, we don't know the full story, to do things that turned out to cross that line of what's not appropriate from a spying perspective. Certainly in Nicole's article, she talks about the fact that when David saw the emails from then First Lady Michelle Obama come across this screen as an analyst, that was that was a red flag that really showed how far it had gone.
Jake, it looked like you wanted to jump in as well, but I also want to ask you if there are any laws that prevent contractors from sharing spycraft expertise with foreign companies that have ties to foreign governments or with specifically foreign governments.
Well, from a spycraft standpoint, with the direct work for foreign governments, yeah, in the U.S. you would have to register basically that you are indeed cooperating with or supplying a foreign power. But from a contract standpoint, it's not always clear, who specifically you're working for and what the scope of that work is. And so, if you look at the story that Nicole published, in this case, that wasn't direct work for a foreign government, it was direct work for a contractor who happened to then be working for that foreign government. For that matter, the line between offense and defense, and I think this is something that's really important for folks to focus on, is not always clear, right? So when we talk about, spycraft, in this sense, do we mean specifically the offensive techniques of compromising a target, or are we talking about the analysis of that data, which can have both offensive and defensive uses? And then, of course, there's a whole range of defensive capabilities as well. Again, it's just not always clear where that line is. So I think that's probably one of the biggest parts about the recruiting side. I think most folks in the U.S. who would be recruited for explicitly offensive missions targeting folks back home in the U.S. Would steer clear away from that. But when it's not published clearly in those terms, I think it becomes much more of a problem.
Stéphane, I want to take a step back and take a look at the kind of impact that cyber attacks could have on specific sectors in any given country. One type of cyber attacks that many might not be aware of are cyber attacks on hospitals and health organizations. I'm asking you about this because you and the CyberPeace Institute have called for an end to coronavirus-related cyber attacks. You've asked governments around the world to take action. How big a threat are these attacks? How much are they happening, and are governments taking action?
Now, the threat is quite big, and what's a bit sad about it, it's not a new threat. It's been there for decades. It's accelerating steadily. And at the peak of the pandemic, the first wave, you could easily document one attack per day on hospital. Imagine if you would have armed group entering hospital once per day in the midst of the pandemic to destroy all the computers. I'm pretty sure the international community would react a bit differently. But we go back to your questions about the knowledge, the awareness of the problem for the citizen. The type of attack are very diverse. Today, you're a professional of health or your patient, you're facing criminal groups that are trying to ransomware your hospital to get money. You are facing state actors that are performing cyber espionage in order to target lab and research center on vaccine. You are facing a group between criminals and states which are launching misinformation campaign in order for you not to trust the word of doctors anymore. So it's quite a complex field, and the threat is sadly accelerating.
Bryson, from your perspective, what's the responsibility of governments to protect their societies from cyber attacks and to ensure that critical infrastructure is protected from hacks and from cyber espionage?
I think it is the prerogative of government. I have been advocating domestically here for even more. I think that the policy discussion has been pulled astray. So I look forward to being able to help refocus that with the Biden administration. I think the appointment of the National Cyber Director, which will have a high-level position focused on cybersecurity and specifically looking at these kinds of domestic issues, which, going back to what Jake and I said earlier, the key with public and private partnership being a significant part of this. Government can't do this alone. Private industry can't do this alone. And as Stéphane noted, the stakes are only getting higher. As we cross from the industrial age into the information age, I think we've now reached this very specific tipping point in the information age where cyber physical systems, the fact that computers are no longer about data, but computers can now affect the physical world. Your critical infrastructure, what's happening in a hospital, where your water's coming from, that's all run by computers. And so we now have serious risk of loss of life or limb being a consequence. And we need to take that very seriously.
Stéphane, I saw you nodding just now. Did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, it's very important comment that was just made, because it has to be a collective effort. For sure, states cannot respond to that on their own. But it's important that states are leading the way. I mean, it's may not be known, but there's tons of initiative, volunteers, journalists, human rights activists that already are providing capacity for free in order to protect the cyberspace, to bring peace to the cyberspace. What we need now is states to lead the way. The conversation of today, in terms of hack for hire, this kind of private companies that can provide capacity to states to act to basically anyone in the world, this kind of model can be explained from the point of view of states that is just, not okay, not acceptable. And moratorium could be looked into for this. So states can really lead the way, and for sure, actors like civil society, like everyone, will be there to support and help.
Jake, the last few minutes, we've heard about the role of civil society, about the role of private enterprise. How much responsibility does private enterprise have in all of this? And especially in the U.S., going forward, are we going to see more cooperation between companies and the government to ensure that infrastructure, is more protected and that these kind of hacks can't happen going forward?
Sure. I mean, look, the reality is that we live in a capitalistic society. And the reality is as well that unfortunately cybersecurity today is seen as a cost center and not a profit center. And I guess technically that is true, right? It is a cost center. Cybersecurity doesn't make money for the organization. It's really loss aversion. And so, one of the things that I think we're going to see is the need for, I suspect, although I'm not necessarily in favor of, I suspect probably more regulation, and very likely that, especially at the small to medium enterprise sizes, I think we're going to need to start supplying, some know-how, whether that's through grants or assistance or whatever form that takes to get some of these smaller organizations, up and running with cybersecurity. The reality is that the smallest organizations play a role in some of the largest breaches that we see. Anecdotally, a very large attack that we worked at my company last year against a very, very large Fortune 500 biomed organization. The command and control for that incident was actually pivoting off of a photography studio that had exactly one employee, a photographer, up in New York City. And so this is a spot where this photography studio had basically abandoned their website, hadn't updated it. Attackers compromised that and then used that as part of their attack on this large Fortune 500 biomed company. And so really, as we look at this, it's going to have to be really a partnership across the board. We can't simply say, as we do in so many regulations today, in the U.S. at least, to say, well, this only applies to if you have, if you're above a certain revenue target or above a certain number of employees. We have to really look at cyber as the entire ecosystem.
Stéphane, in your last answer, you made mention of human rights activists specifically, and I want to dig a little deeper on that, because time and again, authoritarian regimes have increasingly used spyware to go after human rights defenders and activists. Is there a way to reduce the risk that they face?
So sadly enough, this is true. If you look into, go back to the example of NSO Group with the spyware on Pegasus, it's more than 100 victims over the past months, over 46 countries. We are talking about journalists, human rights activists. We're talking about people that in the end are the worst of the asymmetry, because they have little capacity to protect themselves, if no capacity to protect themselves, but they are high targets. And as long as actors, states in most of these cases, can partner hand in hand with private sector that go unchecked in order to develop, procure, and sell intrusion tools that are basically designed only to curb human rights, then we have a systemic issue to any ambition of security and peace in the cyberspace.
Bryson, is there a chance that going forward we could potentially see governments coming together, attempting to protect themselves by entering into some type of cybersecurity treaties? I mean, this would be something similar to nuclear treaties between countries. Do you think that's something that's within the realm of the possible?
So we have the blueprint for what that would look like, and that's called the Talon Manual. And like so many things in the world, it's a great academic answer on paper, and yet nobody has agreed to it in practice. And we see the same issue here because we see nation states wanting to reserve the right to be able to respond or to advance their interests. And of course, cyber is what we're talking about here is only one part of how those national interests are fomented. There are so many other levers of state. I think what we're going to see is the internet as we've known it as a free and open project is dead. That's not going to continue. We see authoritarian countries locking down their own internets. And I think what we're going to see is the world continue to at least bifurcate and possibly break into small pieces of the internet. And those smaller pieces will probably have a informal to formal recognition of some basic rights of what that means to be on the internet.
Jake, it looked again like you wanted to jump in. So let me ask you as well. I mean, are we going to see this type of thing going forward? And please go ahead and expand to the point that Bryson was making, if you'd like.
Yeah, no, Bryson's right. We absolutely have the blueprint for this. He's absolutely right as well that, we are going to see the segmentation, I believe, at least, of the global internet. We've already seen it in China. We're seeing authoritarian regimes, most recently Myanmar, cutting off internet access to their, citizens. We also see as well the limits, even when it's not cut off, limiting what individuals can see. And so I do expect that that's going to continue to bifurcate. But separately from that, a big problem that we have with setting norms, a lot of people like to compare this, compare cyber to, deterrence, maybe in a model that's normally used is in the nuclear age, right? So nuclear deterrence. And cyber just doesn't work the same way. The reality is if we have some type of kinetic attack, attribution of that attack is fairly simple. And the big thing that we lack in cyber today is good, solid attribution. Without knowing and without being able to conclusively say this is who performed the attack, it's very difficult to direct any, well, one, to enforce any deterrence, and two, to direct any countermeasures towards that group. I mean, we have several examples of cyber false flags, as we call them, with adversaries intentionally misdirecting, investigators. And of course, there are probably an unknown number of those that were successful that we just don't even know were false flags. So I think until we fix the attribution problem, I don't see how we get to really a set of cyber norms, because how then will you actually enforce that?
Stéphane, how concerned are you that this all only gets worse going forward? And when we talk about potential worst-case scenarios, what would you envision?
Yeah, just to build on what was said in terms of what would we need to prevent such a catastrophe scenario is there's the existing international law applies in cyberspace. It's recognized, it's clear, and there's a set of norms that has been issued that are there to be followed and enforced. And I really appreciate the comment, because at the end of the day, is when norms are violated or law is violated, nothing is happening in terms of attribution with data that we know what is behind attribution. And I totally agree, in the era of deepfake, we need to have capacity to analyze properly these attacks, but also that this is public in order to link the attack, the suffering, and the law, so that the public, you and I, everyone understand what is happening. And if this continues down that path, then we are facing a scenario where, yes, there's maybe a scattering of the internet. Yes, the dream of CyberPeace is going to be quite complicated, and because it's an asymmetry in between the one that can, at the end of the day, defend themselves and the one that comes.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thank you so much to all our guests, Jake Williams, Stéphane Duguin, and Bryson Bort. And thank you, too, for watching. You can watch this program again anytime on AlJazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We're at AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.